we still have a scarcity of competent individuals because the demand has risen very quickly. To be able to call yourself a competent sort of sustainability leader takes years of experience.
I would say think about what you are interested in and most passionate about, and then choose a pathway into that.
What's your one piece of advice to people who are sitting in a job and going, you know what, I wish I could make more of a difference?
I know it's a really important part of changing careers, and so you have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable and step out your comfort zone and go and say hi, and you'll probably realise that that person was looking for someone else to talk to too.
Hello and welcome to My Green Future, a podcast where we look at career planning through a green lens.
And this is the first episode in this whole series. And for this episode, I am going to be talking to Darian.
Yeah,
I hope you're going to be interesting.
No, why did you come to me for this first?
Because you're actually quite an unusual person in this space.
Oh, that's so true.
You've had an entire career with a sustainability focus, right from when you began your undergraduate degree. This was in the back of your mind. So you've got a kind of an interesting and almost unique perspective on how the industry has developed, where it all was 30 years ago when you started, what the mindset was, and where we stand now in terms of the careers and the thinking and the approach that's brought to it. So just that broad perspective, I thought, was a good place to begin this career.
Okay, so if you want to hear more about what it was like doing sustainability in the 1990s through to today, please listen to this conversation.
And here it is. Let's get into it. Hey, Darian. Funny to have you on the other side of the table this time.
Yeah, it's exciting to be here and with all the greenery.
Well, that tells the story, doesn't it, about where we're going and what we're doing.
It does. Not that I tried to colour coordinate with the wall, but nice to be here.
All right, let's talk about transition. Let's talk about your process and progress into the world of sustainability, because you didn't start there, right? I mean, your PhD is in mechanical engineering, right?
I started in environmental engineering. So I studied in the first intake of environmental engineers in Australia in the 90s. And so what I did was half of a civil engineering degree, half of everything else they thought this new breed of professional might need. So I did a bit of chemistry, a bit of biology, a little bit of population and community ecology. They threw everything in, a bit of economics to boot, and out popped 4 years later the new breed of environmental engineers, which no one was quite sure what they were going to do.
What was the thinking then? I mean, no one knows what they were going to do, but who designed this course, and what was in your mind when you thought, okay, this is where I'm going to go with it?
So it was in the School of Civil Engineering, and the person who put it together, this is just post the Rio Earth Summit, could see that the earth, the environment, it was going to become a much bigger topic. And so they wanted to tweak the civil engineering to make you more able to respond really to the natural environment, but also how people interact with the natural environment. So engineers do a lot of that. I mean, particularly a lot of aid work, relief work is engineers. You have, we were thinking local governments, they do a lot of floodplain management, they will do management of forests, etc. So it was people who are technically trained across all different sciences and engineering subjects who could then step into this gap. But it was at a time before corporates really had environmental teams.
But it was a time before anyone was really thinking actively about the interaction between what we normally do and the environmental situation, wasn't it?
Before, no. The Brundtland Commission had already reported on what sustainable development was. You had the first global
the scientists
summit.
and the smart people obviously had seen these signals many decades before. But in terms of general society, I mean, I'm sure most universities weren't offering courses like that. Most civil engineering courses weren't set up with that sense, were they?
So environmental science courses already existed, and they were called environmental science. I said we were the first of the environmental engineers. So it was new, but it wasn't that nobody had that. So a lot of us went into the big engineering firms, and they already had environmental practices. So I'm happy to say no environmental engineers were harmed in the making of that degree, because we all went on to be gainfully employed. What didn't really exist was the idea, skipping multiple years ahead in my career, of a chief sustainability officer. The idea that someone who's working in sustainability would be in the C-suite of a company wasn't really a concept at that time. It was much more operational, much more functional.
So what was the culture when you first embarked on the job market? You popped out of this with all this training, and what did you find? I mean, the culture, as you say, didn't exist in the C-suite to accept people with this kind of thinking. Tell me about how that was and how you addressed it.
So I went to the Environment Protection Authority, so the EPA, and that was my first proper job out of university.
In which country?
In Australia.
In Australia.
In New South Wales, the fine state of New South Wales. So I was a regional operations officer. So actually I was with everybody else who was also looking after the environment. And it was a great, I'd say, training ground for someone with my background in engineering, because I was an inspector. I got to go out to sand mines, I went to factories, I went to farms. We did inspections from helicopters on the ground. So it was a very practical introduction to what pollution looks like on the ground. If there was an incident, people could call up the hotline. You would be called out to investigate. We had licensing arrangements. So in terms of a first job, getting into sustainability, that was a really good place to be.
Did you think at the time, as you entered this world of work with the mindset and the education that you brought with you, and then you started interacting with corporates and general practitioners, did it occur to you at the time thinking, why are people not taking this more seriously? Why are there not more CE level roles for this kind of work?
It wasn't that I was thinking there should be C-level roles, but I didn't understand the complexity. I have to say, as such an optimist that I am, I thought things like gender equality were solved. I was an engineer. It was the first intake of engineering that had more than 50% females. So I'm like, gender equality in the workplace, done. Climate change, we'll be over that. We'll have sorted that out in 10, 15 years. And here I am now, almost 30 years on, and most of those problems are just as large as they were when I first went into the career. So it wasn't so much that I was looking at why aren't people at the C-suite taking this seriously, as I thought we would be able to apply our engineering mindset to get the solutions to some of these very large intractable problems.
So where are we now, 30 years on? I mean, what is the environment around you for the work that you do? I mean, it is different in the sense that we do have CSOs and we do have a greater public awareness and general awareness of the issues. But in practical terms, describe what the landscape is for you.
So it is very different. If I say now that I work in sustainability, most people are, oh, that's really interesting and I want to move into that, or my child is doing that study. When I started out, nobody cared. It's like, well, that's pretty niche. Why aren't you a proper person doing being a doctor or an accountant or something? So it's much more accepted. People have a lot more language and understanding around ESG and sustainability. So people can talk about the problems. I think anybody could talk about climate change, whether they're for or against, but they have some language around it. But if I look at the big issues and on any kind of indicator, actually, we've probably gone backwards. You know, global greenhouse gas emission concentration has increased. We've lost a lot of biodiversity. Ocean temperatures have increased. You know, any indicator I might want to look at, including inequality, has actually gone in the wrong direction rather than the right direction.
So, I mean, well, I want to look at those people that you just outlined, the people who say, oh, that's interesting, tell me more about that, or my child is getting involved in this, because those are the people now who are increasingly looking to become active and to do something because they've been empowered and activated, if you like. But getting involved is still problematic because, like you say, it doesn't seem as if we have created a circumstance, either at corporate level or government level, where the work that you do is seen as essential, natural, axiomatic in the structure of the workplace. And it's how people get involved in that is a difficulty. So let's look at it from a practical perspective and an academic perspective. Let's start with the academic, because you are an academic. You did actually get your academic qualifications in a related discipline. But for people who have your role now, I mean, CSOs, I see CSOs who don't have the kind of training that you've had. And I've seen people in playing sustainability roles in companies who have very little qualification. So tell me about how you see that, how you see the problems of getting competent people into the roles that need to be achieved.
So I think particularly if you're taking a science perspective, those of us who are in the industry recognize the difference in the specializations. So I wouldn't call myself a carbon accounting specialist or a biodiversity specialist because I don't have that in-depth scientific knowledge. But if someone is just coming into sustainability as a generality and maybe talking about it from a communications perspective, they aren't going to have all of those technical details either. So I sometimes think it depends on the pathway that you come in. So it's different from if you were going to be a chief financial officer, a CFO of a company, I think there's probably a pretty strong expectation that you will have an accounting or a finance degree. If you're going to be the chief legal officer, you will have a law degree. Mm-hmm. I don't think CSOs have only one type of degree. You could come at it from a legal perspective, a communications perspective, a science perspective. Obviously, I'm coming from an engineering perspective. So you're right, I don't think it's been professionalized to that extent. But
should it be?
I think we're still working out the range of different topics that people need to be able to cover. And sustainability does tend to be quite a catch-all. And if I think of the work that I do, I've done a lot of work on business human rights, for example. That wasn't something I covered in depth, certainly not in my undergraduate degree, more in my master's and my PhD. So I think people build up the experience as they go through, and perhaps the formal education and academic side comes with the demands of their job.
But would it help for people who want to get involved in sustainability from now going forward to think about specializing in one of those aspects of the activities, of the requirements?
I think it helps to think about where you want to specialize, but I would also say your career path might not take you where you expected it to go. So people, if I go back to human rights, for example, a lot of people who are doing leading work on human rights, they are legally trained. They have done a legal degree, often specializing in human rights. But I actually don't think just having that legal perspective is the only perspective we should have. I actually appreciate having people who come from different backgrounds and from those different perspectives because it gives you a much more well-rounded and balanced approach.
There is this sense, increasing sense, in the media at least, and amongst the chattering classes, which I count myself as being part of, that there are too many people now getting roles in corporate environments where they're expected to do this stuff and they don't have the chops for it. I mean, I couldn't go into a company and be a CSO now, whereas 4 or 5 years ago, I think I probably could. As you say, you come from a communications background. It used to be a common thing. You can go and talk about this stuff in public and present the company's position on their sustainability activities. But now, if you want to be a CSO, you really have to be able to know what the GRI is. You have to know the practices and the frameworks and the protocols that go into making a company sustainable, if you like, or at least adhering to the regulatory and legal environments that are growing up around them, right?
So that is true. And those regulatory and legal environments are evolving quite rapidly. So if we go back to where I said I started my career, I worked for the Environment Protection Authority. So at that time, the environmental legislation, so this is around clean air, clean water, soils, that was the environmental regulatory framework. And you found that in Europe, you found it in the US and Australia, many countries. But now we're getting to a stage where sustainability reporting, which has been voluntary since the GRI first came around in, I think, the late 80s, and now it's becoming mandatory. So, and it's particularly at that nexus between financial reporting and sustainability reporting that you see mandatory sustainability disclosures becoming regulated in different countries. And so you're right, a Chief Sustainability Officer will have to know the different reporting requirements and regimes and the different laws that are coming in place. The European Union in particular has been quite prolific on different sustainability-related regulations in recent years.
There's it seems to be an increasing correlation between what the CSO does and what the CFO does, because the financial officers do most of the accounting, and the accounting is becoming an increasingly essential part of the whole sustainability activity. Tell me about that relationship, and tell me how a CFO who came into the business as a pure accountant, a financial accountant on the classic terms of running a company, now has to integrate what you do into their work. How's that relationship working out? And if a CFO wants to make progress, or at least someone on the CFO path wants to make progress, how much sustainability training will they need to have from here on in?
So I would say when I started out, CFOs and what happened on the financial side was very separate to what people were doing on sustainability, which, as I said, was quite operational. But as sustainability is integrated into the strategy of a company, it has to become much closer to the CFO's line of business. So if you're only looking at sustainability or ESG as a cost, one, the CFO is going to be trying to control that cost and reduce that cost. And it might not be in their accounting framework to think about what the impact is. They may be in charge of some of the reporting, the financial reporting, which links with sustainability. But then you also have boards of directors having increasing responsibility, whether it's managing the risks of climate change, or it could be diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so the CFO, who is often, the wingman, wing person for the CEO, they will increasingly need to know more about sustainability. So you're right. You have different occupations that also need to know about sustainability other than just the chief sustainability officer. And if I look at my time, for example, with Thai Union, I worked very closely with our CFO, one on green and sustainable finance. So we had got sustainability-linked loans, but also just how do we look at the investment in sustainability. Let's take solar panels as an example. What is the payback period? What are the benefits to the company? How can we make sure this is integrated into our CapEx or our OpEx? So there was a very close relationship between the CFO and the CSO in that case.
All right. So people who want to get into some sort of sustainability-related, climate-related, environment-related, whatever their passion or interest is, they can come from any walk of life, any educational background, and still bring a valuable skill set to that purpose. Having said that, do you think that we're going into a future where, as the demand for these skills and these operational talents increases and becomes more fine-tuned, it will be better for people who want to make that change to undertake a kind of educational upgrade, an additional skill to their quiver? And if so, how do they approach that? Where do they go? Because I'm seeing a whole ton of training courses coming along, and they're extraordinarily varied, and you have no way of knowing, what's good and what's bad. Have you got any advice from that front?
Again, I think you need to consider what you want to work in and what your area of specialty will be. So sitting here in Singapore in a financial hub, I have met a lot of people who have done sustainable finance courses, particularly through UK universities, but sometimes US universities, which will bridge their skills. As you said, perhaps they had training in something entirely different, and then they want to bridge their skills and get more detail on sustainable finance. I have met people who have done degrees, postgraduate degrees and courses on carbon accounting, for example, or soil management or biodiversity. So I think people are going back to get additional skills in ESG and sustainability, but usually with an eye on which part of that sustainability spectrum they want to work in.
I mean, I don't want you to ask you to pass judgment on any of these courses, but there are plenty of the big universities now that are using their brands as premier, premium educational institutions to sell this sort of stuff. Does that convey a particular advantage in this sense, or is any kind of learning valuable?
So I would say I'm a lifelong learner. Any learning has some value, but I do think it is a buyer beware situation. You are purchasing education from these institutions. Some of the courses that are being taught are more valuable than others. And so look at...
How can you tell?
How can you tell? I would have a look at what people go on to do, who they have. Often they have guest lecturers, for example. What kind of experience do those guest lecturers have, or the lecturers who are providing the material? How long has it been going for? So I will name drop one, the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership. That has probably been running sustainability leadership courses for one of the longest times for people who
And one of
want
the
to
best known
convert
ones, right?
into sustainability. And I'm occasionally part of that faculty, and I think they organize their courses very well. But then I know a friend of mine who's doing a master's in, I think, sustainable finance, but she wanted to have a particular focus on biodiversity. So she has chosen a different university because that university had the skills in those sciences that she also wanted to focus on.
Tell me about how you, what kind of problems you've had in your life and your work, because again, to the point that a lot of people are still either in complete denial or trying to get away with doing the minimum possible amount to address these issues, and in any other context. How has your journey been? Is it getting easier? What are the most obvious problems that people need to be aware of when going into this kind of work?
So when I started out, I was very much called a tree hugger. And that was the label that would have stuck around for a good 10, 15 years. Very dismissive. You're nothing but a tree hugger, as opposed to, well, I'm a trained engineer, actually, and I have a lot of work experience. That, I don't think, is the challenge now. Now there are so many different topics that people need to understand. It's hard to be an expert in all of them. And I think keeping up to date with the rapidly changing sustainability environment is a challenge, because there really is a lot happening. There's a lot of research. And you're seeing a lot of burnout because there are so many things going on. Sustainability leads are expected to have such a broad range of knowledge. And often people will go into this because of their passion, that they want to make an impact and they're doing it for some kind of greater good. And certainly I went into it because I was passionate about it. When I worked with WWF, that was something that they really emphasized, that people are going into these roles not because they're highly paid, but because they have purpose. But when you're doing a job with purpose and you don't feel like you're making progress, I feel like that's when you start to burn out. If all you're doing is hitting a brick wall constantly, or you never feel like you're having the impact that you want to have, then I think people start to become disillusioned and burn out.
Are there other brick walls? I mean, you mentioned attitude, calling you a tree hugger. I mean, that was an attitudinal response that I still see everywhere. Not so much now. I mean, people are beginning to back off with that stuff. But apart from attitudinal obstacles, what other brick walls are there that people should be aware of?
I think one of them is the challenge of getting over that this isn't just about communications. It's not just about writing a glossy report, that it has to be integrated into business strategy. This is the way your organization, it doesn't have to be a business, it could be a government. It's the way everything should be run to have a sustainable long-term outcome. And being put into the box of merely communications, I think, is sometimes still a challenge. The money to do this effectively. So we had a bit of a conversation about the CFO. If you're expected to change the world, but given no budget to do it, then you won't really be able to change the world. And making sure that you have that buy-in from the top, whether that's the top of the government or the top of the corporation, there has to be a will to change. One person, even if you're in the C-suite, but particularly if you're at the middle of an organization, you can't change the whole way an organization operates if you don't have that mandate.
Tell me some stories about issues that you've had.
What kind of issues?
Then you just
that I've
tell
had?
me, give me an anecdote as to some of those obstacles and how you got over them.
Oh, that's going to take a bit of thinking. An obstacle and how I overcame it.
It's an interview question.
It is an interview question. I'm trying to think, which job am I applying for? I'll give you a perception story going back to a brief conversation we had before coming online, Tamor, which was about Ghostbusters, which is a film, the original Ghostbusters is a film that is very close to my heart. I went and saw it when I was young, really loved it. And there were the baddies who tried to shut the Ghostbusters down, a guy with a red beard. And I would have watched it at the time, but the fact that he came from the EPA meant nothing to me, just over my head. And it wasn't until I became part of an EPA, so the New South Wales EPA, that I watched Ghostbusters again and realized the bad guy who wanted to shut the Ghostbusters down was from the EPA. And I was like, wait a minute, I'm a good guy. We're the good guys from the EPA.
Well, it's the attitude stuff we talked about, right?
That is the attitude that, and still you absolutely get it now, particularly with all of the anti-woke, anti-ESG movement that you have in the US, that the people who are trying to save the planet are the ones who are wrecking the planet. And it's a very weird context to be working in. And when you think you're working on the right side, to be told that you're the ones who are the problem, not the solution.
You have a lot of people that come to you and say, Darian, advise me. What do I do? What's the most common question you get asked about from people like that?
People who want to move into sustainability but aren't quite sure how to get into it from where they are now. So whether they are most often they're in communications, or they are in law, or they are in finance, or it's a young person who's just going to university and wants to think about what would a career look like. And so it's moving those chess pieces across the board to think about where they want to end up.
They come to you with their particular questions. How do you answer them? Are they asking the right questions usually? And when they do, what tips do you give them?
So I can only answer from my perspective, obviously. And I've already said I came into this with a passion and a purpose before I chose environmental engineering. I wanted to do something with nature, with the environment, with animals. So I was driven by my passion. So when people ask me about what should they do in sustainability, usually my first bit of advice is follow the path that you are most interested in, because that's the one that's going to be the easiest to stick to. And I think of someone who came to speak to me in communications who'd started doing a very technical master's in environmental sustainability, and she hated it because it was all science and it was very detailed. It wasn't really what she wanted to do. And so because there is so much specialization in courses, I would say think about what you are interested in and most passionate about, and then choose a pathway into that.
In journalism, whenever people ask me about getting into journalism, the first thing I say is, if you're not dedicated mentally and spiritually to it, then you're not going to find money here. So that conflict between I want to be rich and famous and I want to do something purposeful is something that I've sort of dealt with all my life. Is that a conflict in this particular space?
It's interesting. I came into this space without any real thought of making money. Like, it was something I wanted to do to have an impact. But as sustainability has gone up the ranks and you have chief sustainability officer, you have whole organizations dedicated to sustainability, the fact is there is money at the top end of the market that can be made, but there are also a huge number of roles where you could be doing something very fulfilling, but it doesn't pay you very much.
And then there's the burnout thing you mentioned earlier on. I mean, you can make money at it, but you have to be absolutely dedicated. If you're not, and if you're not, it's going to be a problem, right?
I mean, there's a real irony in the world of fighting modern slavery that I get asked to do work on ending modern slavery all the time for free. And I'm like, what is it about ending modern slavery and making sure people get a fair wage that makes you think that I can do this for no money whatsoever? So you still have parts of the sustainability field that aren't very well compensated.
That's actually interesting, isn't it? Again, the attitude seems to be a lot of, well, if you're passionate and dedicated and you're a tree hugger, then you're willing to do this for free.
Yes, you are willing to do this for free, whereas I suspect in other professions you wouldn't be expected to do it for free. It would be seen as a job. So getting paid to do this work that actually is important to the rest of society as well, I think is important. And that people stand for that and say, no, I deserve to be paid for this because I am doing a proper job.
We talked about the nuances involved, not only in the role, but in the way the environment is evolving and the legislative and regulatory environments are evolving. But they're evolving in very different ways in different places. I mean, when people come to you and say, I want to get involved in this sort of space, would you say that there should be a different approach depending on what country they're in? I mean, if someone in Singapore comes and says that to you, or someone in Sydney or London, are there elements of that they should be considerate of?
I think there are, because let's say in Australia, you may end up going into the mining industry, or you could go into food and agriculture. In Singapore, a lot of it tends to be finance or government. So depending on the country you're in, that will dictate what kind of industries exist. I wouldn't necessarily say to be ruled by the regulatory environment, although of course that will have an influence. But depending on if you are passionate about the oceans and marine biology, maybe don't go to a landlocked country.
Yeah, no, fair point. If you live in Singapore,
make.
don't go into farming,
Yes.
farming related activity.
But even then, there are still pockets. I mean, Singapore has its commitment to 30% self-sufficiency by 2030. And so there is actually a lot of money that goes into innovation in food and agriculture in Singapore, even though it's not the same land-based food and agriculture that you might see in other parts of the region.
Fantastic. So let me finish with just a general question and a general observation. I mean, what is your top tip for people looking at this kind of career? Is it you need the passion to survive? Is it you need a particular focus? Or is it go for it and see what happens?
I think it is an industry that attracts people who have a passion for what they are doing, but also be willing and open to change, because it's not a fully formed industry yet. It's still evolving and you don't actually know where it might take you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Darian.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed that conversation. Thanks for watching. Now, the whole purpose of this series is to be able to inspire others to take action to make their careers more green and to think about how they can influence the green agenda within the companies that they already work for. And I hope if you are inspired at all, then you'll get in touch and engage with us a bit.
Now, we know just from speaking with all of our guests that this can sometimes be a minefield. It's hard to know where to start, what are the best courses, what are the best sources of information. So if you'd like to get in contact, please email us on the email below or contact us through LinkedIn.
And if you have any thoughts about kind of subjects you'd like to hear us discuss, or people or industries that you'd like featured on the conversation, let us know about that as well. Get in touch.
Thank you.